The refusal. The salt wind carried the scent of ruin through the harbor district. Isabella Moretti stood before the empty warehouse that had once thundered with the sounds of commerce. Crates being stacked, merchants haggling, dock workers calling out inventories in voices that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Now there was only silence and the musty smell of abandonment. Her father's warehouse, her family's legacy, empty. She pressed her palm against the weathered wood of the main door, feeling the splinters catch at her skin. 3 generations of Morettis had built their reputation on fair dealing and quality goods. Her grandfather had started with a single ship. Her father had expanded to 5. And now, in the span of 18 months, it had all crumbled to dust. Not through any fault of their own. Not through poor business or bad luck with the sea. No, they had been deliberately destroyed. Lord Dominic Ashford had seen to that. The man controlled half the trade routes along the coast, and he was systematically absorbing the other half. Independent merchants like her father were obstacles to his vision of a unified trade empire. He didn't compete, he conquered. He would undercut prices until his rivals bled gold, then buy their businesses for copper. He would monopolize port access. He would whisper in the ears of city officials until permits were denied and licenses revoked. The Morettis had been proud. They had refused to sell. They had fought back with every strategy they knew. They had lost. Isabella's father now lay in their modest home 3 streets from the harbor. His body broken not by disease but by despair. The physicians said his heart was failing. Isabella knew better. It was breaking. Every labored breath he took was weighted with the knowledge that he had failed to protect what his father had built, that he would leave his daughter with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. She turned from the warehouse, pulling her wool shawl tighter against the autumn chill. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. She needed to get home before full dark. The harbor district wasn't safe for a woman alone, especially not one whose family had enemies. The sound of drums echoed across the cobblestones. Isabella froze. She knew that rhythm: 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. It was the herald's call, summoning citizens to the central square for an official proclamation. Her stomach clenched with instinctive dread. Nothing good ever came from those summons. Not anymore. But curiosity and a lifetime of facing problems directly drove her feet forward. She joined the stream of people flowing toward the square, merchants closing their shops, dock workers leaving their posts, families clutching children's hands. The crowd gathered in the large plaza dominated by the marble fountain, its waters now sluggish and choked with fallen leaves. On the raised platform before the fountain stood Lord Dominic Ashford himself. Isabella had seen him before, of course, but always at a distance. Up close, he was more imposing than she'd imagined. Tall, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of aristocratic features that belonged on ancient coins, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark hair that caught the last rays of sunlight. He wore black and deep blue, colors that spoke of wealth without ostentation, power without peacocking. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. She hated him on sight. Beside him stood his herald, a rotund man whose velvet coat probably cost more than her father's medicine for a month. The herald raised his hands for silence, and the murmuring crowd obeyed. Citizens of Salina, the herald's voice boomed across the square. His lordship, Dominic Ashford, lord of the Eastern Trading Companies and protector of merchant interests, has heard of the hardships facing many of our independent traders. The recent adjustments to the trade markets have, regrettably, caused difficulties for some of our smaller enterprises. Adjustments. Isabella's hands clenched into fists. He made it sound like an act of nature, not a calculated campaign of financial warfare. In his great generosity, the herald continued, Lord Ashford has established a relief fund for those affected by these market changes. Loans at reduced interest, direct financial assistance for those in most dire need, access to new trade routes and merchant partnerships. All those who wish to apply need only present their circumstances to the trade office before the week's end. A ripple went through the crowd, a mixture of desperate hope and bitter resignation. Isabella saw the faces around her. people she'd known her whole life. The Castellis, whose spice import business had folded last spring. Old Pietro, who'd lost his fishing fleet. The widow Rossini, whose husband had thrown himself from the cliffs when his debts became insurmountable. They were all trapped. Dominic Ashford had engineered their ruin, and now he offered himself as their savior. They would take his help because they had no choice, and in doing so they would become his. Their businesses would bear his mark. Their loyalty would be purchased. Their pride would be the price of survival. His lordship wishes you all to know, the herald concluded with a flourishing bow toward Dominic, that Selina's prosperity is his highest concern. No one need suffer when help is readily available. The crowd began to murmur, some already pushing forward with questions about the application process. Isabella saw the calculation in their eyes, weighing dignity against desperation and finding desperation heavier. But Isabella had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his warehouse keys. And she had inherited her mother's fire, though her mother had been dead 10 years now. She pushed through the crowd, her worn dress and simple shawl marking her as one of the afflicted rather than a spectator. People parted for her, some with sympathy, some with curiosity. By the time she reached the front of the crowd, near enough to see the platform clearly, the herald had begun describing the application procedures. "And what of those?" Isabella called out, her voice cutting through the herald's speech like a blade through silk. "Who want nothing from him?" The square fell silent. Every eye turned to her. The herald's mouth hung open mid-sentence, and Lord Dominic Ashford's gaze found her, sharp and assessing. "Speak, girl," the herald said, his tone mixing condescension with irritation. "What is your grievance?" "Not a grievance," Isabella said, lifting her chin. "A refusal." She heard gasps around her. One didn't refuse a lord's charity. Not publicly. Not when the entire city was watching. "I am Isabella Moretti," she continued, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "My father is Antonio Moretti, who built a merchant business from nothing, who dealt fairly with every client, who never once used his position to crush a competitor. Lord Ashford's adjustments," she loaded the word with contempt, "destroyed everything my family built, and now he offers us charity, relief, as if our ruin were an accident, a natural disaster he had no hand in creating." Dominic still hadn't spoken, but his eyes never left her face. She couldn't read his expression. Was it anger? Interest? Contempt? "We don't need his relief fund," Isabella said, addressing the herald but speaking to the whole square. "We need him to stop strangling independent trade. We need fair access to ports and routes. We need the same opportunities he enjoys. But he won't give us that, will he? Because that would mean competition. That would mean sharing power." "Mind your tongue, girl," the herald snapped, his face reddening. "You speak to a lord of the realm." "I speak to the man who killed my father," Isabella interrupted, her voice rising, with passion. "Oh, Antonio Moretti still breathes, but barely. His heart breaks a little more each day, knowing he'll leave me with nothing. That's the real cost of Lord Ashford's market adjustments. Not just gold and goods, but lives, dreams, legacies." She turned her full attention to Dominic now, meeting his eyes directly, an act of shocking boldness for a commoner addressing nobility. "Keep your charity, my lord," she said, her voice dropping to something quieter but no less fierce. "We are not beggars. We are merchants. We were your equals once, before you decided equality threatened your profits. I will not accept help from the man who orchestrated our destruction. I will not sign my name in your ledger and become your property. I will not trade my family's honor for your blood money." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella heard her own heartbeat loud in her ears, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her back. She had just publicly humiliated the most powerful man in the city. She had refused his offer before the entire population of Selina. There would be consequences. But her father had taught her that some things mattered more than safety. Dignity, self-respect, the right to stand on your own feet, even when standing meant starving. "We will manage on our own," she said finally. "Or we will fall on our own. But we will do it as Moretus. Free." She turned her back on the platform, another shocking breach of protocol, and began walking through the crowd. They parted for her like the sea before a ship's prow, their faces showing a mixture of awe and terror. They were watching a woman commit social suicide, and they couldn't decide if she was brave or mad. Perhaps both. Isabella didn't look back. She walked with her spine straight and her head high, though her knees trembled and her hands shook. She walked past the fountain, past the market stalls, past the familiar streets of her childhood. She walked until she reached her father's house, a narrow building with faded blue shutters and a roof that needed repairs they couldn't afford. Only when the door closed behind her did she allow herself to collapse against it, sliding down to the floor. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd refused a lord's help in front of the entire city. She'd called him a killer. She'd accused him of corruption and cruelty. And he'd just stood there, silent, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Isabella?" Her father's voice drifted weakly from the bedroom upstairs. "Is that you?" She wiped her eyes quickly, forced steadiness into her voice. "Yes, Papa. Just home from the market." She climbed the narrow stairs to his room. Antonio Moretti lay in the bed that had once held him and her mother, now looking far too large for his wasted frame. He'd been a big man once, strong from years of hauling cargo and climbing ship rigging. Now he was paper-thin, his skin gray, his breathing labored. "Any luck with the cloth merchant?" he asked, hope flickering in his faded eyes. Isabella had spent the morning trying to sell their last bolt of quality silk, a remnant from their final successful shipment. The cloth merchant had offered a third of its value, knowing she was desperate. "He's considering it," she lied gently. "I'll go back tomorrow." Her father smiled, trusting her completely. "You're a good girl, Isabella. Smart. Like your mother." He coughed, a rattling sound that scared her. "Promise me something. Anything, Papa. When I'm gone, don't let pride destroy you. If you need help, if someone offers you a way forward." He paused, struggling for breath. "Take it. Don't be stubborn like your old father." Isabella's throat tightened. If he knew what she'd just done in the square, it would kill him. She'd refused the one source of help available to them. She'd made an enemy of the most powerful man in the city. And she'd done it for pride, for dignity, for the exact stubbornness he was warning her against. "Rest now, Papa," she whispered, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. "Everything will be fine." But as she descended the stairs and began the evening routine of stretching their meager food supplies into something resembling dinner, she wondered if she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. The knock came 3 days later, just after dawn. Isabella had spent 72 hours in a state of anxious waiting, expecting retaliation, anticipating punishment. Lord Ashford had the power to make her life even more miserable than it already was. He could have her arrested on false charges. He could spread rumors that would make her unemployable. He could foreclose on the tiny mortgage her father still carried on the house. But nothing had happened. The city had buzzed with gossip about her defiant speech, but no official response had come from Lord Ashford. It was the silence that terrified her most. She didn't know what it meant. The knock, when it finally came, was businesslike. Not the thunder of guards come to arrest her, but a simple rap of knuckles on wood. Isabella opened the door to find a well-dressed clerk standing on her threshold, holding a leather portfolio. Behind him, a wagon waited in the street, piled high with crates and barrels. "Miss Moretti?" the clerk asked politely. "Yes. Delivery for you, miss. From Lord Ashford." Isabella's blood turned to ice water. "I don't want anything from him. Take it back." The clerk consulted his papers, unperturbed. "I'm afraid I can't do that, miss. My instructions are very clear. The items are to be left whether you accept them or not." He gestured to the wagon drivers, who began unloading. "Stop!" Isabella rushed forward, but the men ignored her. They worked with efficient speed, carrying crate after crate into her narrow entryway. Flour and grain, salt and sugar, smoked fish and dried fruit, a small cask that sloshed with what smelled like wine. A firewood, neatly bundled. A heavy box that, when she pried it open, revealed expensive medicines. The kind her father needed, the kind she could never afford. "This is not charity," the clerk said, reading from his paper. "Lord Ashford wishes you to know that these items are compensation for a warehouse property that was acquired through aggressive trade practices. He has reviewed the Moretti business records and determined that adequate compensation was never provided for the loss of your trading opportunities. This delivery rectifies that oversight. Compensation, not charity." The distinction was calculated, designed to slip past her pride. Isabella wanted to scream. She wanted to throw every crate back onto the wagon. But her father was dying upstairs, and one of those medicine bottles might give him another month, another week, another day. "Take it all back," she said, her voice shaking. "I told him, we don't want his help." The clerk simply bowed. "The delivery is complete, miss. What you do with the items is your own business. Good day." He left. The wagon rolled away, and Isabella was left standing in her entry hall, surrounded by enough food and supplies to keep them comfortable for months, feeling more trapped than she'd ever felt in her life. Dominic Ashford had learned nothing from her refusal. He'd simply changed his tactics. She spent the entire day returning the items. She hired old Pietro's grandson with her last coins to help her load everything back onto a borrowed cart. She wrote a letter in her best hand and sealed it with wax. "I told you once. I tell you again. We need nothing from you. Leave us alone." As the cart disappeared down the street, heading toward Lord Ashford's grand estate on the hill, Isabella felt a grim satisfaction. Let him try again. She would refuse him every time. He would learn that the Moretti pride could not be purchased, no matter how prettily he wrapped his manipulation. High on the hill in his study overlooking the harbor, Dominic Ashford received her message. He stood at the window watching the ships come and go, watching the city he controlled with such precision. And for the first time in his adult life, he was genuinely surprised. He'd expected gratitude. He'd expected her to see the difference between public charity and private compensation. He'd restructured the delivery specifically to preserve her dignity. But she'd sent it all back. Again. Dominic turned the letter over in his hands, studying her handwriting. Firm, clear, educated. Most merchants' daughters of her class could barely write their names. But Isabella Moretti had been educated, probably by her father, probably in the same warehouse where she'd learned to read cargo manifests and calculate trade margins. "Leave us alone." Such a simple request. Such an impossible one. Because Dominic had spent the past 3 days learning everything he could about Isabella Moretti, and what he'd learned had made him deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. She was right. He had destroyed her family. Not through personal malice, but through the cold calculation of business. The Morettis had been an obstacle to his consolidation of trade routes. So he'd removed them, just as he'd removed dozens of other obstacles. He'd never thought about what happened to those obstacles afterward. They were names in ledgers, failed competitors, the inevitable casualties of commerce. But Isabella had forced him to see the human cost. Her father dying slowly, her empty warehouse, her desperate attempts to sell family heirlooms. And through it all, her fierce, unbreakable refusal to bow. She'd called him a killer. The accusation had struck deeper than any insult he'd received from rival lords or angry merchants. Because unlike their insults, hers was true. Dominic set the letter down carefully on his desk. He looked at the map of his trade empire that hung on the wall, the pins showing his holdings, the red lines connecting his routes. It was an impressive achievement. He'd built it through intelligence and ruthlessness in equal measure. But he'd never asked himself what he was building it for. Power for power's sake. Wealth for wealth's sake. Control because chaos frightened him more than any enemy ever had. Isabella Moretti had chaos in her eyes. She had pride that bent under pressure but never broke. She had the kind of strength that didn't come from gold or position, but from something more fundamental. something he'd forgotten, if he'd ever known it at all. He couldn't force her to accept his help. That much was clear. Traditional methods, money, power, official channels, were useless against someone who valued sovereignty more than survival. But there were other ways, quieter ways, ways that would require him to think like Isabella Moretti instead of like Lord Dominic Ashford. He would have to learn her world before he could hope to exist within it. He would have to understand what she needed, not what he thought she needed. And most importantly, he would have to earn something he'd always taken for granted: her respect. For the first time in years, Dominic Ashford faced a challenge that interested him more than any trade negotiation or business acquisition. He had to figure out how to help someone who absolutely, resolutely, did not want his help. It was impossible, which meant, of course, that he had to try. The understanding. Dominic Ashford had built an empire on information. He knew the cargo manifests of every ship that entered the harbor. He knew which merchants were solvent and which were drowning in debt. He knew the price of silk in the eastern markets before the silk merchants themselves did. But he knew nothing about Isabella Moretti. Not the things that mattered, anyway. He knew her father was dying. He knew their warehouse stood empty. He knew she'd sold every piece of jewelry her mother had left her. But he didn't know why she woke before dawn every morning. He didn't know what she did with those desperate, determined hours. So he decided to learn. The harbor district transformed in the pre-dawn darkness. The raucous taverns fell silent. The street vendors packed away their wares, and the cobblestones grew slick with fog rolling in from the sea. Dominic stood in the shadows across from Isabella's narrow house, dressed not in his usual fine clothes but in the worn canvas trousers and rough wool shirt of a dock worker. He'd told no one about this. Not his steward, not his guards, not even his business partner. If word got out that Lord Ashford was skulking around the harbor district before sunrise, dressed like a common laborer, it would damage his carefully cultivated reputation. But reputation meant nothing if he couldn't understand the woman who'd publicly refused him. The door opened. Isabella emerged, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times it was more thread than original fabric, and her shoes, he could see even from this distance, had holes worn through the soles. She moved with purpose, her stride quick and efficient. Dominic followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. She didn't go toward the market square or the merchant district. Instead, she headed down to the docks themselves, to the section where the fishing boats came in. The fishermen were already returning with their night's catch, their boats heavy with the morning haul. Isabella approached one of them, old Marco, whose family had fished these waters for 5 generations. Dominic watched as she handed the man a few copper coins and received in return a bucket of fish. Not the premium catch that would go to the restaurants and wealthy homes, but the smaller fish, the damaged ones, the ones that wouldn't sell well at market. She thanked Marco with genuine warmth, then moved to the next boat. And the next. She was buying the discards, the fish that would otherwise be thrown back or used for bait. Dominic's curiosity deepened. What was she doing with fish? He followed her as she made her way back through the awakening city, her bucket now full. But she didn't go home. She turned down a narrow alley that led to one of the poorest sections of Salina, a place where the buildings leaned against each other for support, where children played in the dirt because there were no gardens, where the smell of poverty was as thick as the morning fog. Isabella stopped at the first house, little more than a shack, really, and knocked. An elderly woman opened the door, her face lighting up when she saw who it was. Isabella handed her several fish, refused payment with a gentle shake of her head, and moved to the next house. She went to a dozen homes that morning. At each one, she was greeted with gratitude, sometimes with tears. She distributed her entire bucket of fish, keeping nothing for herself. When she was done, she didn't go home. She headed to the textile district. Dominic continued to follow, fascinated and increasingly uncomfortable. At a weaver's shop, Isabella presented a small piece of embroidery work, delicate, beautiful needlework that must have taken hours. The weaver examined it, nodded approval, and paid her a handful of copper coins. Isabella immediately crossed the street to a pharmacy and used most of those coins to buy medicine. She pocketed 2 coppers, probably all that remained of her morning's work, and headed home. Dominic watched her disappear into her house as the sun finally crested the rooftops of Selina. She'd been awake for hours, had walked miles through the city, had given away food to those even poorer than herself, and had earned barely enough to buy her father's medicine for another few days. Tomorrow, he knew she would do it all again. He stood there in the growing morning light, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: shame. He'd thought her refusal was about pride. He'd thought she was stubborn, foolish even. He'd been so certain that his wealth and power were the solution to her problems. But she didn't need a savior. She needed what he'd taken from her: the ability to earn her own way. He destroyed her family's business, eliminated their income, and now she was surviving through sheer determination and backbreaking work. His charity hadn't been rejected because she was too proud to accept help. It had been rejected because he was offering to solve a problem he himself had created. Dominic returned to his estate on the hill, his mind churning. He went straight to his study and pulled out the files on the Moretti merchant business. He read through every report, every transaction, every note his agents had compiled during the systematic destruction of their trading operation. It was all legal, all technically fair business practice. But seeing it laid out before him, the deliberate undercut pricing, the closed port access, the whisper campaigns that had destroyed their reputation, he saw it for what it was: calculated cruelty. He'd done this to dozens of families. The Morettis were just the ones who'd refused to quietly disappear. For the next week, Dominic continued his dawn surveillance. He watched Isabella's routine, learning the geography of her desperate daily fight. He saw her buy the discarded fish. He watched her distribute them to families who would otherwise go hungry. He observed her earn copper coins through needlework and small trade jobs, always just enough to buy medicine and cheap bread. He saw her father's condition worsen. Through the warped glass of their window, he could see Antonio Moretti's form growing smaller, more frail. He saw Isabella sitting beside him in the evenings, reading to him from an old book, her voice carrying. He knew she would do it all again. He stood there in the growing morning light, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: shame. He'd thought her refusal was about pride. He'd thought she was stubborn, foolish even. He'd been so certain that his wealth and power were the solution to her problems. But she didn't need a savior. She needed what he'd taken from her: the ability to earn her own way. He destroyed her family's business, eliminated their income, and now she was surviving through sheer determination and backbreaking work. His charity hadn't been rejected because she was too proud to accept help. It had been rejected because he was offering to solve a problem he himself had created. Dominic returned to his estate on the hill, his mind churning. He went straight to his study and pulled out the files on the Moretti merchant business. He read through every report, every transaction, every note his agents had compiled during the systematic destruction of their trading operation. It was all legal, all technically fair business practice. But seeing it laid out before him, the deliberate undercut pricing, the closed port access, the whisper campaigns that had destroyed their reputation, he saw it for what it was: calculated cruelty. He'd done this to dozens of families. The Morettis were just the ones who'd refused to quietly disappear. For the next week, Dominic continued his dawn surveillance. He watched Isabella's routine, learning the geography of her desperate daily fight. He saw her buy the discarded fish. He watched her distribute them to families who would otherwise go hungry. He observed her earn copper coins through needlework and small trade jobs, always just enough to buy medicine and cheap bread. He saw her father's condition worsen. Through the warped glass of their window, he could see Antonio Moretti's form growing smaller, more frail. He saw Isabella sitting beside him in the evenings, reading to him from an old book, her voice carrying through the thin walls. And slowly a plan began to form. Not a plan to buy her cooperation or overwhelm her with resources. A plan to give her what she actually needed: opportunity. The Seabird was a merchant vessel that had seen better days. Her hull needed caulking, her sails were patched, and her captain was close to retirement. But she was seaworthy, and more importantly, she was available. Dominic purchased her through a series of intermediaries, ensuring his name appeared nowhere on the documents. He had her repaired, not lavishly but competently. He registered her under a false trading company. And then he waited. The notice appeared in the harbor master's office on a Tuesday morning. Merchant vessel seeking independent trader for coastal routes. Small cargo capacity. Reasonable terms. No experience necessary, training provided. Apply at Dock 7. Dominic knew Isabella read the harbor notices every morning, searching desperately for any opportunity. He designed this one specifically for her, small enough not to be intimidating, practical enough to seem legitimate, with terms generous enough to be attractive but not so generous as to seem suspicious. He waited at Dock 7, again disguised as a ship's captain, weather-beaten coat, salt-stained boots, the kind of man who'd spent his life on the water. The Seabird rocked gently beside him, her newly repaired timbers creaking in the morning breeze. Isabella arrived just after dawn. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the ship with an expert gaze that told him she'd spent time on merchant vessels, probably learning the trade from her father. "You're inquiring about the position?" Dominic asked, keeping his voice rough, his posture casual. "I am," Isabella said, her chin lifting in that familiar defiant gesture. "Though I should tell you up front, I have no capital to invest. If you're looking for a partner with gold to contribute." "Looking for someone who knows the trade," Dominic interrupted. "Someone who can manage cargo, negotiate with suppliers, keep accurate books. The ship provides the capital. The trader provides the skill. Profits are split 60-40. Her eyes widened. 60-40? In whose favor? "Yours," he said. "Ship takes 40% for maintenance and operating costs. You take 60. She stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. That's more generous than any arrangement I've ever heard of." Dominic shrugged, playing his role. "Ship sits idle, it earns nothing. Rather have a smaller share of something than a large share of nothing. Besides, I'm old. Don't have the energy for the running around anymore. Need someone young and motivated." Isabella walked closer to the Seabird, running her hand along the hull. He could see her calculating, her merchant mind assessing the opportunity. This was exactly what she needed. A chance to rebuild, to earn, to prove herself. But he could also see the suspicion in her eyes. "Why me?" she asked. "You posted that notice 2 days ago. Surely others have applied." "They have," he lied. "But they wanted to start with silk and spices, premium goods, high risk. You read the notice and came anyway. That tells me you're practical." "I need practical." She was silent for a long moment, her hand still on the ship's hull. "I'd want to see the contracts, the cargo manifests, the route licenses." "Wouldn't trust you if you didn't," Dominic said. He handed her a folder he'd prepared. "Everything's there. Take it home, read it thoroughly. Meet me here tomorrow if you're interested." Isabella took the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. "This seems too good to be true." "Maybe you're due for some good fortune," Dominic said quietly. She met his eyes then, and for a moment he thought she might recognize him. But he'd cultivated this disguise carefully. The weathered skin, the gray in his beard, the slight stoop in his posture. He looked nothing like the lord who'd stood on the platform in the "Someone who can manage cargo, negotiate with suppliers, keep accurate books. The ship provides the capital. The trader provides the skill. Profits are split 60-40. Her eyes widened. 60-40? In whose favor? Yours, he said. Ship takes 40% for maintenance and operating costs. You take 60. She stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. That's more generous than any arrangement I've ever heard of. Dominic shrugged, playing his role. Ship sits idle, it earns nothing. Rather have a smaller share of something than a large share of nothing. Besides, I'm old. Don't have the energy for the running around anymore. Need someone young and motivated. Isabella walked closer to the Seabird, running her hand along the hull. He could see her calculating, her merchant mind assessing the opportunity. This was exactly what she needed. A chance to rebuild, to earn, to prove herself. But he could also see the suspicion in her eyes. "Why me?" she asked. "You posted that notice 2 days ago. Surely others have applied." "They have," he lied. "But they wanted to start with silk and spices, premium goods, high risk. You read the notice and came anyway. That tells me you're practical." "I need practical." She was silent for a long moment, her hand still on the ship's hull. "I'd want to see the contracts, the cargo manifests, the route licenses." "Wouldn't trust you if you didn't," Dominic said. He handed her a folder he'd prepared. "Everything's there. Take it home, read it thoroughly. Meet me here tomorrow if you're interested." Isabella took the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. "This seems too good to be true." "Maybe you're due for some good fortune," Dominic said quietly. She met his eyes then, and for a moment he thought she might recognize him. But he'd cultivated this disguise carefully. The weathered skin, the gray in his beard, the slight stoop in his posture. He looked nothing like the lord who'd stood on the platform in the